And bang. And here we are again. It's Language of Healing Live. Today we're going to be talking about chapter 13, which is sharing the table and the discussion. And trust me, there's going to be some discussion today. Our moderator was not playing. We got some questions in advance. We have with us today Lisa Vitello, who is a true voice, a public voice for those who are in pain. She is the founder of CultureBrave. They were so gracious to allow us to launch our book with one of their groups. And we are very honored to have Lisa here. There's a million more things I could say about her, but trust me, she's got some questions. So Lisa, welcome today.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
So here we go. You can just jump right in.
Okay, we're just going to jump in. Okay. So I picked this specific chapter because I actually attended American University's Summer Institute on Educational Equity and Justice. They did a virtual conference on uplifting women and girls of color through anti-racist pedagogy, policy, and practice. And we were talking about having a seat at the table and what that table looks like and whether or not we as the global majority, we as BIPOC actually want a seat at that table or want to create our own. So I thought it was especially fitting that I choose this chapter because that really spoke to me. So at the beginning of the chapter, you all reference having a seat at the table as it relates to business, right? Arnita, you mentioned being frustrated having to sit back and wait for a seat at the table. And there is a Black proverb that states, in America, you gotta work twice as hard as white folk to get half as much. I know that in the 6 or 7 weeks since Derek Chauvin murdered George Floyd, there has been a massive push, and perhaps unprecedented, for equity that has, in my opinion, since dissipated. I have seen it dwindle a lot. I have seen allyship and calls for allyship diminish. And I want to know, what does that say about our sustained willingness to allow our unfettered access to this proverbial table that is where everyone wants to be?
I think the key word there that you use is sustained access. You know, sustainability is something that's so very important. As a leadership development person, sustainability, I normally represent it with a model being a three-legged stool. If all three legs of the stool are equal, the stool will sit and it will have weight and be able to be sustained. If one of the legs is off a point of an inch, the stool doesn't do what it's supposed to do. So the way I see it for the sustainability of allyship, there has to be three things very much present at all times. Number one, it has to be a priority. Now, whether it's a personal or a structural or an institutional, at first, at best, it has to start as a priority. And after that, we have to look at policy. There has to be hiring policy. There has to be anti-harassment policy. There's so many policies that have to come into play. And also there has to be some level of personal activism. Where do you want to be on the scale? Do you want to be on the scale? You know, some people are going to march. Some people are just going to correct someone who says something insensitive in a conversation, but decide where you want to sit on the bus when it comes to being sustainable in this talk. Again, I'm the one who always says, if you don't want to play, don't play, but just be quiet. You know, just be quiet. So sustainability will always have to have at least those three main aspects, in my opinion, for us to keep going forward. Have I seen the needle move? Yes, yes, of course.
Sorry, has the needle moved enough?
No, of course not. The needle hasn't moved enough, but the needle moving is indicative of at least another level of conversation and understanding happening. And so for me, I'm going to applaud all progress, as long as it takes us in a direction of being more unified as humanity. I'm going to applaud it. I'm not going to say I'm not going to look at where we're not. I'm going to look at the inches the steps that we're going forward, because I think that's what brings healing, and that's what brings us hope. It encourages us to actually step more into personal activism without yours having to look like mine and vice versa.
Okay, so question for you specifically then, are you willing to wait for the needle to move a little further, or is it time for us to create our own table?
You know, man, I was not liking you for that question. Yeah, I'm just gonna tell you, I'm gonna put it out loud on YouTube. You know, this is what I want. This is what I would say. Can I have a both and on that?
Explain,
I do not
elaborate.
have the personality to sit back and wait. For instance, if you tell me no 3 times, I'm going to create an organization, a table, a house, a hut, a she shed, or something on my own, because I'm going to do it. It's just a matter of where I do it. So kind of a both and an. There's so much value in creating your own table, but there's also value in integrating a table that you haven't been at before, and being on the front side of that. As hard as that is, because that's very, very challenging. There's so much value in both. Life is too short to wait for people to give you approval and permission to do what you know you're supposed to be doing. And so I hope that answers your question enough, because I just want both.
Lisa,
Okay.
can I jump in on that?
Of course.
I grew up in a very racist atmosphere, and I have sat as a grown man with many white supremacists, where I've got, there's me on one side of the table and someone who is a total white supremacist, admittedly so. And here's something that I hear. So why do we need to let them into our golf clubs? Because they can just have their own. Why do we need to let them into our schools? Because they can just have their own. And they can make it excellent, just like we've made ours excellent. I'm telling you, that's the talking point for segregationists. And when we start talking about shouldn't we build our own table, isn't there a possibility we might be playing right into the hands of that?
Okay, question for you.
Yes.
And those of us who are Black on this panel might be able to shed a little bit of light. There is talk of that in our community as well. And it is not necessarily seen as a negative.
Right.
There is a push to get back to all Black schools, all Black communities, all Black, all Black, all Black, if, and this is a big if things are equitable. That's the key word. When you go to an HBCU, as an example, you typically go because you know you will find there a shared experience, a shared understanding. You will have professors who understand where you've come from, who will address educational aspects that are specific to you and your culture. You don't get that at a PWI. So I'm not going to say where I stand on that, but there is value in having something that is not, how should I say this, regulated by the dominant culture.
Sure.
That we don't have to feel like we have to fit into what the dominant culture wants. That we don't have to feel like we have to beg or fight for space.
And I probably lean more towards where Arnita was. It's both and rather than either or. But there's a part of me that just says, I don't want to give an inch to those who believe in segregation. I don't. So that's where I'm at.
Yeah, and I choose to live in a predominantly Black neighborhood, my choice, because I want to be able to go jogging and not fear for my life. So it's not an easy thing, and I look the way I look, and I still make these choices. If I were a Black man, I would have to think even more about the decisions that I make. So Bob, you touched upon white supremacy, and I know typically when I do these kinds of talks, when I say that word, people get very uncomfortable. And I don't know if people quite understand the meaning of the word. It sounds so, it's diabolical in a way. We think of it as, oh my gosh, I'm not a white supremacist. But more of us are than we think we are. And I think that's another understanding, to know where you sit, to know that if you're upholding this system, you might not be a racist per se, but you're upholding white supremacy. So I think that's something that we might want to discuss here too, for those that might feel that they are one and the same. They're not necessarily.
Right, and I'd love to hear what Wayne has to say on that, but I'll tell you, when we hear white supremacist, we think of someone in a white hood. The guys I sat with, one was an oil company executive, and the other was also a professional. I can't remember exactly. Oh, a police officer. Hello, a police officer. So that's how that goes. So I'd love to hear what Wayne has to say on this.
Oh, you chicken! You just passing it off to me, huh?
Ha ha!
Well, I think we're at a time of still trying to define these words, because they mean different things in different cultures. The question was, what do you feel when you hear the word white supremacy? And to be honest, it makes my heart hurt. And when I think of it, I think of people who intentionally want to live that lifestyle, who want to hold to whites are spiritually, intellectually, emotionally superior to other races in the world. And I think what you said earlier, Lisa, it's abhorrent. The thought of that is abhorrent to me. It makes my heart hurt. And I think when most whites hear it, most people in my group hear it, they hear intent behind it. They hear you're intending to build a white supremacist culture. And I think that's what makes this conversation kind of break down, because I don't think the intent's there. I think most of us are unwitting partners in a culture that is weighted towards us without really realizing it, because we are 61% of the culture. It mostly came from white Europe. It has values in it that many of us champion and value, and can't separate between sharing the table more broadly and losing the values we hold most dear. And that's not just racial. I mean, that's down to economics. And I think economics is probably the controlling thing, because I don't know it's white supremacy. I think it's monetary supremacy. Okay, I'm not in a demographic anymore that advertisers value. I'm not. No one's building products for me. I'm a 67-year-old white male, and I'm not anybody's chart, because one, advertising doesn't affect me. I don't even listen to it. I skip it when I can. I'm not motivated by it. So nothing's being designed for me. And so we get back to the original question about, should we get into this table or have our own? And I think that's two different conversations. To my culture, I'm going to say we need to be more inclusive. The first question we need to ask when we're trying to solve a problem is, who's not at this table that needs to be at this table? So I'm going to say that till I'm blue in the face. Now, I'm never going to say to a Black community, you need to get your own table. I'm never going to say it, because I don't want it to happen, okay? But I've also, take The Shack, for instance. When we got ready to produce The Shack, no Christian publisher would publish that book. No secular publisher would publish that book. So did we make our own table? We did. Then they all come to us begging, we want to put that in our table. And so, and when the movie gets started, Lionsgate would not allow the word Jesus to be used in the film, even though he's one of the main characters in the story in the book. We don't want it there. And that wasn't, as many Christians think, well, that's anti-Christian. They're just against Christians. No, they're not. They're about maximizing profit, not having anything in there for which China might exclude it being in their country or it working in Islamic countries. So they just downplay. And all that's driven not by atheist supremacy, it's driven by the economic dollar. We're going to be as broad as we can so that we don't offend anybody who might have access to the movie. And I think that controls a lot of what we talk about in terms of white supremacy. A lot of it's driven not so much by philosophy as it is economics. And how do we get the largest bunch of people we can to buy our product? And so I think rather than white being supremacy, I think cash is supreme. And I think political power to gain that cash, I think that's corrupted the whole system. And it keeps us from getting forward on the issues that I'm concerned about. I know that you are too, Lisa.
Yes, and I agree with you. And I I do feel like it's an economic controller. But if we're being honest, in this country, who controls economics? It's
No, I
you.
grant you that. I
It's
grant
Bob.
you that. Yeah, I grant you that.
um, so,
Can
you know,
we
go ahead.
can we jump in? Can I jump in and comment
Go
here?
ahead.
Okay, so I live in China, where I've lived for the past 4 years, and I'm a teacher here at an international school. And I grew up in Mississippi, so
Yeah.
grew up in Mississippi, lived in Texas for a few years, and I've lived in Alabama, I've lived in Louisiana, so in many parts of the Southeast. And I can tell you that white supremacy is one, just like what was previously stated. You think about white supremacy, you think about like the movie American History X, or you think about, Klan meetings and all that kind of stuff, when really it's just a system that our forefathers, I think we need a new name for that, but the people who came over here and established the America, or
Their
over there
forefathers.
and
Their
established
forefathers.
the America that we know today, right? Those people created a system that they knew what they were doing. And that's one reason why I reject the notion that, racism is a byproduct of ignorance. I reject that notion because it isn't. This was put together by people who were very well educated. It was a system that was meant to last for generations, and it has also permeated the globe in every race. And so growing up in Mississippi, in a family that championed education, in a family that didn't live where a lot of the other Black people lived, we lived in the country, which all of Mississippi really is a country, but we lived across the street from a farm. And, me talking the way that I talked and having the experience I was having, and Black people telling me that I wanted to be white, that I thought I was white. And I'm looking at this going, no, I have probably studied more Black history, more about our culture, done more digging than anybody else that I knew. But because of the way that I spoke and because of certain aspirations that I might have had, Black people were telling me that I wanted to be white, which was frustrating because all it did was perpetuate the idea that success is only reserved for white people. That is a white supremacist concept, right?
Absolutely.
That affects Black people.
Absolutely.
Living here in China, I've had Chinese students. Now this is a culture with a 5,000-year history, right? Like America is like 20 years old compared to the age of China. And I've had white students look at me and tell me that white men saved the world. If it weren't for white men, the world would be nowhere near where it is today. And that, if Black people want something, then we should all, quote unquote, be more like Obama, and then maybe we would get it. And this is also white supremacy. When you have, it's so funny because, we have students who are willing to, a lot of them want to go to the US and, pursue their higher education. And if they feel like if they are light-skinned enough and if they can just get the dialect right, then they can pass as white people. And my husband even had a student look at him and say, well, I'll be just fine because I'm white. People won't be able to tell. And we can absolutely tell, but he's convinced himself, and so this idea of white supremacy is not something that's so sensational. It is just American culture, but the marketing in the United States is so good that what we do is that we take these terms and we create a caricature of them when in reality it's just the reality. White supremacy is just real. And what we are seeing is some of that coming undone, is being dismantled, and people are in a panic. And I, for one, am enjoying watching to see like what's going to happen. I think that where we are right now has been necessary for a very long time. But it's also a very different experience over here in the East. It is very different the way that it is playing out. The way that doors have opened in just the past 2 months has been tremendous. And people ask me a lot, what is the difference between racism in China and racism in the United States of America? And I tell them, racism in the United States of America is very much about identity, because it determines what you think about yourself, what you think about other people, and where you can go. Whereas here in China, the people aren't really invested in it as much. There are a lot of Chinese people who think that racism doesn't exist because like they don't even have a word for what we describe as racism. They have something else. But they have a lot of misconceptions about the way the racism plays out, you know, across the world. But their openness, you know, when students, I've had students tell me, I can't believe what you say until a white teacher confirms that it is true. You know, I've had students tell me all kinds of crazy stuff. But what I have found is when I sit down with them and when I really break it down and explain it to them and I show them, you know, facts, figures, videos, graphs, all that, they go, oh, okay, well now that
But
makes
you
sense.
shouldn't have to do that.
You know,
You
no, it's
shouldn't.
not about. Well, here's the deal. I don't believe in should, because by definition, should doesn't exist. It is something that we don't have, right? So should isn't something that I give a lot of attention to. I very much deal in just what is, and what is that here in China, when I put forth the same efforts to the people here that I put forth in the United States, people in China are much more receptive. And so I can give them the information and they go, oh, okay, I see what you're saying. And now we have less of a problem. Whereas those same efforts in the United States of America go unheard, relationships break up because of them. You know, it's just very different because the racism in the United States of America is very much steeped in identity. So when it comes to white supremacy, it has absolutely permeated the globe. And my family has been fortunate to be able to travel to a lot of different places. But the way that it plays out is different. A lot of the verbiage is the same, but the consequences are different. Like here in China, no cop is going to kill me. I'm not scared to walk up and down the street. You know, somebody might look at me and they might not like the way I look, but they're not going to touch me. I'm much safer here because the way that it plays out is very different. My husband, who is 6'5", my 2 Black daughters, we're safe. We don't get nervous until we get ready to go back to the US.
Yeah, I think, you know,
So,
we've touched upon so many things with regards to colonization, decolonization, colorism. I've spent a lot of time in Asia myself. My father's wife is Singaporean Chinese. So we could have a whole conversation about that, but you know, we can say that we could have a whole week's worth of conversations just on
yes.
what we've touched upon thus far.
I'd like to add with the white supremacy. The reason, you know, it's like Bob said, we tend to think organizations and extremism when we hear white supremacy. It just means that white is centered in the United States of America. White thought, white everything is centered. It's the thing from which everything else is compared to. That is the problem. And the issue is it's so socially acceptable. There are various lynchings are not acceptable. The KKK is not acceptable. There's so very few things that are just not acceptable that the subtle, the covert racism, the adverse racism in supremacy we don't talk to. You know, I'm kind of like Jasmine. I could be an expert in something and somebody will go verify that with a white person. You talk about burn me, oh, you lose me then. And I'm thinking, well, you know, I kind of know what I'm talking about. No, I got to go ask somebody else. So I understand that's what white supremacy does to us in our paradigms and every day as we relate to people. It just makes you question. And why are you questioning it? And I don't think a lot of people have that brought to their attention or even have to think about the covert aspects of white supremacy in this culture. It's everywhere. It's everywhere. The extreme is it's what we put emphasis on, but it is everywhere. I have not been a place where I have not seen the threat of white supremacy. I have not been there. And I know that word is hard for people, but in America, we think white is superior. And that's just a softer way of saying it. That's just a softer way of saying it. If supremacy is the offensive word. But we're just not being honest enough about that. Sorry, Joshua, go ahead.
I'll piggyback on you with that because I do think it's so deep in everything that we do in thinking and talking and growing up that the thought of it being removed out scares people. It literally scares them because it's a whole new change. What do we do then? Because I'm getting on my thing right now. My watch party is, what are you going to do about it? Well, we're going to do it together. Like, that's the whole point. We got to admit that we have a problem, and it's so deep that we have to get together to do it together. And I'll piggyback, and I want to chime in on the whole separate. It's a shame that we have to do that because we're unwilling to sit here and accept one another. I think I posted in the Language of Healing about the Crown Act. It's a necessary, unnecessary law. It's a shame that we can't accept people for who they are.
In 2020.
In
Exactly.
2020.
In 2020, we had to create a law
For natural
saying
hair.
that Black people could wear their hair the way it naturally
work.
comes out of their head.
Yeah, and it's just like, I think you have on your notes there talking about when it comes to hiring, we have to have a law to give equal opportunity. That's a shame. That's sad. And if we want to say this country is great, it's not so great because we can't even accept one another. And it's totally sad. But you know, the whole point is when somebody hears white supremacy, why white people cringe, because and they try to get off, and it's like, it's supposed to be uncomfortable. It's not supposed to be comfortable.
Yeah.
Let's get over that. It's uncomfortable, and we have to deal with crap. Let's do this. Like, we have to unroot this thing.
Because life is uncomfortable for people of color
Exactly.
every day. Every
Exactly.
day.
Yeah.
Exactly.
If I can, sorry I was late.
Of course.
I heard the news about Senator Harris. So my mom's an AKA, so everyone's
Okay, yes,
blow-
of course.
blow my phone.
All the AKAs.
Yeah. But Lisa, you said something that I totally agree with. Like, I grew up in an all black church, and growing up, I went to all white schools. Literally, there's about 300 kids, 400 kids, and there was 4 Black people in the entire school district. My mom was a teacher there, so Monday through Friday, we were in a predominantly white space. And so on Sundays, I'd ask my mom, like, hey, why are we going to this all Black church? Like, what, she's like, hey, Nick, like, I just want to be comfortable in my own skin. I deal with, I'm in this white space Monday through Friday. So on Sundays, it's just kind of like a breath of fresh air. You know what I mean? Like you said, like how at HBCUs, there are teachers, right, who understand other people, who understand the kind of things that you're going through. I asked on Facebook about probably like 4 months ago, just my Facebook friends, like, hey, when was the first time you ever had a Black teacher?
Yes.
And a lot of people said never. A lot of people said your mom. My mom was their first Black teacher. A lot of people said the high school, college. And I think that kind of plays into white supremacy. Like, imagine being an African American, boy or girl or a minority person of color, and the first time you ever see someone that looks like you or remotely looks like you is in high school, like teaching, right, in education. Someone in a higher status is teaching you about American history, when you're, in college and you're an adult. So I think that's really telling about white supremacy. I see it often as a server at a restaurant. Like Arnita said, I see the subtle racism. I think most people in America can get behind like the egregious racism, right?
Yes.
The hoods and the
Yes.
Mississippi burnings. But that's why I love the movie Jordan Peele's Get Out, is because the racism is so subtle. You know what I mean? Like, it's not so in your face. The racism is so subtle, and that happens to me all the time as a server. Of course, I'm one of the only Black servers at my restaurant, and I'll serve people, and they say things like, "Oh, you speak so well," right? That's going to take you places, right? I hear, I've heard that so many times. Wow, you're so intellectual, you're so thoughtful, like the way you speak.
You're so articulate. Yeah, exactly. You're so articulate.
Right, and again, these the underlying subtleness of whiteness, right? Whiteness is king.
White-centeredness, yes.
White-centeredness is very apparent in our country. So, yeah.
Again, that could be a whole separate conversation. It's
jump in there on that one. I teach at a predominantly Hispanic school, and most of our staff is either Hispanic or Black. And so I see that I'm the minority in my classroom every day, but yet I watch how the education system in my school is still centered around me. It's still centered around my viewpoint and my worldview and the way I was raised. It's still centered around that. And so even though my school would be predominantly educators and children of color, it's still centered around me. And I have to look at that and think, I have immigrant children, I have Black children, I have first and second generation immigrants, and it's centered around me. I think we lost Lisa. But the whole system is designed around me, even though I'm a minority. Testing, curriculum, literature, even the way we teach math, even the way we focus on our kids for our STEAM subjects, and the way we promote scholarships and things like that, it's still centered around whiteness. And who is at the table? I look at my school and who is at the table? You know, this chapter is about the table. The table at my school should be centered around the experience, the culture of the kids of color and the teachers of color. And yet the education system is designed so that's not true. So as an educator, my subversive way of looking at it is I'm coming in to center it back around my kids. I'm coming in to center this conversation back around my kids and to work on the system from the inside, to reset, to smash I don't know what you want to call it, but to smash that and to confront that and to change how we look at that, to change our testing, to change our meritocracy that we still have. You talk about, you know, Wayne, you mentioned you're a 67-year-old white man. Well, who makes our laws? Who sets these educational policies? So, you know, we see that even though I am the minority in my school, the white supremacy is still so obvious. One of the activities I've planned for my kids, we're online right now, but I've designed a lesson where we are confronting their history textbook, their Texas history textbook, to see whose voices are centered there. And so there you go. I'll step down off the soapbox.
It's okay, we have Lisa back.
I'm so sorry. Not a good look when my Zoom cuts out. And I'm bummed because I really wanted to hear what you had to say, Nancy, but I'll look at the recording. Because
we're still right where we were. So lead us on, Lisa.
Yes. So I want to talk about, I was going to touch upon the Me Too movement, but I'm a big sports fan. I know you are, Bob. So you mentioned in the chapter about the Brooklyn Dodgers signing Jackie Robinson. I'm a native Montrealer. So for me, Jackie Robinson is especially relevant, not only because he played before he got to the Brooklyn Dodgers, he played for their farm team, which was the Monarchs in Montreal. From the Negro Leagues. And it was a big deal for him to move from the Negro Leagues to the Brooklyn Dodgers. He desegregated the game. What we don't take into consideration, though, is that when the biggest person moves from a predominantly Black situation or of color and goes somewhere else, what that does to what they leave behind. So in essence, there are many people who feel that Jackie Robinson leaving the Negro Leagues was single-handedly the reason that the Negro Leagues ceased to exist. So again, at what cost do these things happen? At what cost does it make sense to?
Well, you are literally referencing a seminal moment in the history of our nation. 1947, Branch Rickey from the Brooklyn Dodgers signs the first African-American player. And Jackie Robinson, you're right, he was already a commodity. He was very, very well known. But I'm going to hold that up as breaking a barrier. I mean, the color barrier came down that day. And so, yes, it came with consequence on the backside to a culture that had to then look at things through a different lens. But I'm going to say that lens was expanded rather than contracted, because now opportunities are out there in places where they didn't exist before. So I understand what you're saying, but anytime we make progress, there's always going to be pain on the back end. I have a friend who likes to say, there's never been a birth in history without blood. It's just how it goes. So that's a really good question, by the way. You need to unmute.
I hear what you're saying. I agree with what you're saying.
I think Connie's trying to talk.
Okay, go ahead. Go ahead, Connie.
I was just going to say that it's interesting because listening to what Lisa just said and listening to Bob, there's a point of view question here. I mean, you can talk about pain and you can talk about gain, but where's the point of view coming from? And that is ultimately, to say that I just think that matters. And I think there's, this habitual, certainly for me, way of looking at things from a white point of view and assuming that that is the point of view. And anyway, I just was hearing that as you were both speaking. So.
I think that's spot on. Again, it's that white-centeredness, because I was going to follow up by saying, I agree with what was said, but at what cost? If there's a handful, relatively speaking, of Black athletes who have then gone on to the NBA, the NFL, etc., was it worth it for now there not to be a place for more Black athletes to have thrived? There's a program now with HBCUs called HBCU Jump that has been created since the murder of George Floyd, and it's trying to get these elite athletes to go to HBCUs as opposed to PWIs. That will change the game, literally the game and the game exponentially in terms of what revenue schools bring in, the HBCUs versus the PWIs. It will change the way student athletes are groomed as to where they want to go. And I don't know if people realize the trickle-down effect of what Black athletes bring to the table in terms of athletics and the money that goes to these predominantly white institutions. So I wanted to talk a bit about that. First, to see if anyone's heard about HBCU Jump and what our thoughts are on the possibility.
Well, I'm the mom of a collegiate basketball player, and so certainly I've heard of it. I'm thrilled to see it. I will say, having gone through the recruiting processes 3 times because he transferred schools, just this past time where he has a 5th year of eligibility at a HBC at another school, he's graduated undergrad. This is the first time that he's ever been approached by an HBCU. So I would definitely say the timing of George Floyd has made a difference. Normally when we're approached with recruiting situations, recruiters have a lot of hard work to do and they cannot spend a whole lot of time with just in a certain place. So often the first question we get is, would you be interested in an HBCU? And so I think sometimes the recruiting process screens it too heavily. But now, after George Floyd, these kids are so much more in the know about racial justice, social justice. HBCU Jump has come at a perfect time for recruiters to be aggressive about going for elite athletes. This is what I've noticed recently, where there have been elite athletes that would have no HBCUs in their top 5 choices for school. At least they have one there now. And that's very different and very encouraging for me to see all for it. I think this is a great, what's going on is a great pathway for those schools to recruit a different level of kid, different level. Sure.
Yeah, and it goes back to creating our own table, really.
Yeah.
Well, I played college sports, and my freshman year, I went to an HBCU. It was amazing. I loved it. It was awesome to be like in the midst of all these Black people who had a common goal. However, I didn't have a positive experience playing sports at that university. And there are many more people like me who also did not have a positive experience playing at that university. And many of us had our scholarships taken for no real reason at all. Fortunately, well, let me say this. I played one sport in which I excelled in high school, played that sport at this HBCU. And there was another sport that recruited me as well. So even though I wasn't on scholarship for the second sport, I still competed for that second sport and did quite well in competition. When the coach of the first sport that I was on scholarship for, by the way, I had the highest GPA on the team. I was never in trouble. I did everything I was supposed to do. She took that scholarship because for the reason that she did not recruit me, because she, like one coach recruited me, he got fired, new coach came in, she released a bunch of us. So then I went to the coach of the second sport that I played at that same school, who had told me that if things didn't work out in my initial sport, that he would give me a scholarship. I went to him, and then he told me, well, I'm not going to give you a scholarship because, you know, it looks like I'm just your second choice. Okay. Well, fortunately, I had a coach in high school who really looked out for me. He contacted other coaches who recruited me in high school, and I ended up going to an SEC university and was able to compete there and did very well there and broke records there. My point is this: we can't assume that just because an athlete goes to an HBCU, that they will have the experience that they have worked for. And so what is going to have to happen, you know that saying, every brother ain't a brother, right? If we are going to encourage athletes, because this is a huge deal for athletes. I know that that was a goal that I worked towards my entire life. My older brother was the first person in our family ever to graduate from university. He played football, played in the NFL for a little while. This was a legacy that we were building in our family, right? I never would have thought that at an HBCU, something like that would happen to me, but it did. And even later, like I went back to that HBCU to a basketball game, and I was talking to a friend. He was like, "Where have you been?" I said, "Well, I transferred." I explained everything to him, and there was an older Black gentleman who walked past me. And when I told my friend where I was at school now, he said, "Oh, so you went to the white school?" I said, "Well, the white school gave me a scholarship." You know, so, and they are going to give me the opportunity to compete. So I think that when we are talking about the HBCU jump, which I think is great, I mean, I think that Black people should have that experience of being in a Black space, because it's a completely different experience. But there's a lot of accountability that comes along with that. And my story is not a one-off. I know many Black athletes who have had that experience both at the college that I went to and at other HBCUs. There has got to be that level of accountability at the HBCUs to make sure that these athletes are getting those 4 years and are getting the opportunity, because I know, like, that left me a little bit jaded, because I was like, what happened to all this, you know, looking out for each other we're supposed to be doing? What happened with that? You know, and that didn't happen with me, and it was unfortunate, and it's something that I hate to see happen to other people. So
I understand. I mean, I do understand where you're going. To go back to Lisa's question, I do think that HBCU pathway is a good pathway, because some of what you're describing, Jasmine, happens to athletes in PWIs as well.
Yes,
Some
it
of
does.
that is just the system. It's just the system. There's so many African American athletes who go to PWIs who never graduate as well. So I think I appreciate you bringing that there, but I think in general, to have those kids look at schools that may have teachers a little bit more set on helping them be successful with a 4-year degree rather than play 2 years and be out, may be well worth it in the long run. And
Oh, I'm not
just a
talking about the
mom
teachers.
of
I'm
an
talking about the coaches.
Yeah, I
And
understand.
yeah.
I understand. I understand. I'm looking at the whole system. Yeah,
Can
I'm
I
looking
chime in on
at
the HBCU jump, ladies? Daniel, hi, I'm Rosalind. I know I joined late, but I'm working. But with that said, I'm a product of the HBCU, as well as a former athlete at an HBCU. And my brother is now head coach at a HBCU in football. And I also have a sister who's a high school coach, varsity coach for volleyball at a predominantly Black school. With that said, I had a tremendous experience. I had an opportunity to go to a Pac-10 school. Never took a second look at it because I was groomed to go to HBCU. To get that experience, and my parents kept me around that. My father had gone to one, and I wanted that experience being raised in a predominantly small white Texas town. But the benefit that I can share from going to a HBCU as a Black athlete is that the teachers did care. Had one of the highest graduating percentages. And like you, I have the highest GPA my freshman year playing basketball. And just the experience you get from being able to be yourself, because coming from a small town and being raised Catholic and being around a lot of white people, you know, your hair, your dress, your dialect, everything is in question. And even, why are you here? Are you really that smart? Whereas you go there and you have a comfortability just to be you and to compete. Now, do we have issues? I went in knowing there were issues, from housing to getting funding to holding my scholarship because they may or may not have funding. So you talk about the HBCU jump and putting the athletes back into HBCUs. We cannot overlook, to your point, Jasmine, the issues that come with that, but that's because equality and equity are two different things. And when you don't have the money there, to provide to the athletes to continue the scholarships, and you come across some pettiness and individual things, I had some of that too, but that happens at white institutions, but not so much as the money, because that money follows where you're excelling in sports. And if all our top athletes are going to predominantly white schools and making their programs great, that's where the money is. And that is simple as that. And then how do you expect for Black colleges to compete? Again, it's a difference with equality and equity. And if you're saying that we're equitable, we should be getting some kind of money to make it equitable for our athletes to go and have decent housing, have the equipment they need, not just on the field, but in the classroom. I'm very passionate about that because it's not equitable. So that's why athletes jump and go to PWIs. My daughter's at UT now, you know. That was a battle for me, you know, having an HBCU history, because I know what she was missing, you know, as far as learning about who you are and where you are, and at this time in this country. So HBCU jump, I think it's very viable. I love it. But in order to encourage or continue to encourage it, we have to look at what's equitable and getting that into the HBCUs as well. And it starts with our athletes going back there, but to sustain them and give them what they need. It's not as pretty as going to the white schools. It's not. The dorm, the living situation, the money that's being handed out.
Shiny.
You know, up under the table, you know, and just out front. It's not. But it benefits them a lot more because they get to learn who they are, and they get to grow into young men and women to be proud and go on to get degrees and do more even in their communities, and not separate, you know. But I think they should have a choice. No, there's no one size fits all, but we definitely have to make it more equitable in order to keep our athletes there. And once they get there, the athletes that are staying, so that they have an opportunity to thrive in that environment. And that's one thing at any Black college, even as a student, we're missing out on the money. And we know the sports bring the money, and it's not equitable at any institution right now in compared to your PWIs, even your small ones to your large ones. It's nowhere close. Having experienced both.
I want to talk about equity versus equality, but I do want to touch upon even beyond the Black athlete. There's a statistic that I read, and this was a number of years ago. I went to a conference at Loyola Marymount University in Los Angeles, and they were talking about getting Black students to stay in school and to graduate, and they couldn't figure out why this didn't happen. They were giving scholarships and they couldn't understand why Black students wouldn't stay in school. And I said, well, if you're giving out academic scholarships to a private school, you know, the school is $50,000 a year in Westchester, a suburb of Los Angeles, California, these students still have to figure out a way to live. You're not covering their living expenses. They're not covering a dorm or an apartment. So even if you're covering $50,000 worth of tuition, which is fantastic, if that student still has to come up with $10,000 a year, to you, that might not be a lot of money. To a Black family, that might be an awful lot of money. And if they have more than one student, that could be $10,000, $20,000 that they don't have lying around. So again, it goes back to equity versus equality. Not everyone knows the difference. Rosalind, you touched upon it, but I want to discuss that further because I think it's something vital in terms of our understanding about anything related to these topics that we've been discussing today. Arnita, you're smiling. Do you want to?
No, I was actually gonna say, you know, Wayne is great with that. So
okay.
I think Wayne should speak, but I'm not. I didn't want to put him on the spot. This is why I started smiling. So I'll defer.
Yeah, I'm not sure how we're all defining those terms. I look at equity and equality kind of this way, and this go back to bridge builder days when California was extending the rights to gender identity in public schools, and they passed a law that you could come to school in their gender perception of choice, or what you felt like was real for you. And they gave them the right, which is the equality, but they didn't give them the equity in that you couldn't go there because no one did the work of helping prepare it to be a safe place. So the first kid in my community that goes to school dressed out a little more female than male, he gets shot at school. So equality is he had the right to do it, but the equity is he didn't have the reality to do it. The right was something passed in Sacramento, but there wasn't any equity brought to it in terms of the real thing. And I think that's true in a lot of the spaces we're talking about now, whether it's racially or whatever. You can pass a law and make something equal, but to give it the equity, to actually give it the reality that that right gets to be lived without a negative consequence from the angered person or whatever, then the equality over the long haul doesn't matter until you also have the equity. And I don't necessarily see that equity as always financial. I think there's ways, it's easy, well, not easy, but it's one thing to pass a law to get a right. It's another thing to educate the culture to make that right practicable. And that's what our democracy always leaves out, because our laws or our court decisions are always filled with such hostility that at the end of it, people aren't re-educated on the other side to actually make room in our culture for different realities. And I'm hoping, Lisa, I'm not quite as, I think, feeling futile about the discussion changing after the George Floyd and the protests. Certainly, I think we saw with Colin Kaepernick, his protest was hijacked by the right by making it about military, not about Black. So his whole protest was hijacked to disarm it. I think the protest following the George Floyd thing has been hijacked by the ultra left. Now it's gone to defunding police, and people who were from the dominant culture ready to have a different conversation got scared out of that conversation because it went to things far. Again, extremists always pull things to their end of things, but the people I know like me are doing a whole lot more reading and learning right now and having conversations about equity. I'm actually encouraged. I think there's a tipping point that we've reached. It's not going to be something the media covers because the media wants conflict. And the better conversation, I'm having more conversations about this than any other time in my life. And they're healthy conversations with white people who are willing to take a look at some of these terms they've resisted and actually see their stake in it, actually see their participation in it. So I'm not as discouraged. I think the conversation is changing because you just can't, you can sustain protests and all that stuff that dazzle the media only so long. But I think more people are interested in learning and making better choices. I'm hopeful of that.
I'll add to that, Wayne, too.
Yay.
I'm seeing that as well in my circles. I live in Pennsylvania, but I'm originally from Texas. And before that, my family are all farmers in Missouri. And so I grew up in a very white world where, you know, hearing racist jokes and stuff from extended family, that was normal. And it wasn't until I moved to the Northeast and was forced into an environment. I mean, believe it or not, I'm ashamed to admit I was forced to be around Democrats for the first time. And I realized, oh, these people love Jesus just like I do, and they vote a different way, and they're, you know, whatever. And so, make a long story short, when my wife and I bought our first home, we bought in an area that was mostly white, but we told ourselves, okay, we live in an all-white community. We can't go to an all-white church. And so we picked a church that was diverse. But even talking about the white supremacy and stuff, I'm actually on a committee right now to actually make the diversity in our church, maybe the word is equity. I don't have the right language for it, but we have just as many Black people as we do white people in our church, but the primary voices in leadership are still wealthy, white men. And so the committee that I'm on is, okay, how can we expand this voice that, okay, if we're truly going to be diverse, like, congratulations, we put people that don't look like each other in a room for an hour, and then we go back to our separate worlds. We've got to actually give those people, create space at the table. But I'm encouraged by what you said. I'm seeing a lot of that too, privately. I'm even seeing people that are in the subcultures, like what I was in, I've been very vocal on Facebook and stuff about this. Nancy and Arnita know this. They've seen me be very vocal and seen me shot down, and I'm still kind of emotional about it because I'm young, and I'm like, I don't want to offend. I just want everybody to get along and love everybody. But here's what I'm encouraged about is I'm having offline conversations by people that grew up in cultures like I do that have told me this summer they've started reading all of these different books. They've started watching. I talked to a Christian comedian from a small town in Georgia that's she told me she's watching all these movies. She's like, I've watched Just Mercy 3 times. I watched 13th twice, and she's like, and I just laid down on my floor and I cried and I repented and I asked God to show me more and all. She hasn't hardly put a word of this on Facebook because she doesn't know how to articulate this in a way that people can even understand what she's experiencing. But she's having this moment where she's realizing. And honestly, that's why I was quiet for most of this hour, because I'm just listening to everybody going, I don't know a lot about this, and I still need to learn more. But I'm encouraged because even though I think kind of a lot of the online conversation is getting hijacked, in private, I think there's people that are very curious and they want to know more. You know, even my some people in my family have come to me and told me, you know, we don't know what it's like to grow up Black in this country. We're never going to know what it's like to grow up Black in this country. And so it's time we start listening to these people and listening to their experience. And honestly, that's sad that's like kind of where we're at. It's like we should be doing more, but I think it starts with that. Like, if we don't listen, we're not gonna get anywhere. And having that openness, I'm seeing that. I'm also seeing a lot of reactions and stuff. It's fun.
Hey, Tony, you wanted to jump in. Tony, go ahead.
I certainly did. I appreciate y'all giving me the opportunity to be here. Just a little background on me. I grew up on the south side of Chicago. I now live in Houston, Texas. I went to an HBCU. I've been in law enforcement. Now I work for a conservative insurance company. I'm not gonna say which one, but the dynamics that you all have been talking about today, a lot of it can be true all at the same time. And I think these are the challenges that a lot of people have when we try to approach one subject or another. When we talk about equity, we bring in what resources or what transitions are we going to put in place in order to make that equity a reality. When we talk about diversity, what does that mean to some of us? Well, to some of us, or to most people, in layman's terms, it means to bring in a collective, different people with different thoughts and different backgrounds in order to contribute ideas and talents in order to take you to a specific goal. Then, we talk about the power structures and the economic classes as a part of that equity struggle. And we never, we really don't entertain the background as to why this equity piece is really being pushed. Is because, as a class, African Americans never really, we didn't have an opportunity to really bring that equity along or that equality along. And even though laws had been passed in the past, specifically with the civil rights legislation, it didn't necessarily mean that it was going to be an equitable transition, because the power structures still resisted that type of transition and providing resources. And Lisa, when you alluded to the struggle with HBCUs and the transition of athletes, I think what we're talking about is a void being left with the transition of our talent, which is the same struggle that we have in leadership. When you have people like John Lewis passing away, then we ask a question: who was going to fill his shoes? Well, in that process, we have to really consider what have we been doing to prepare that transition? Who have we been grooming? So it's a perpetual process. In the middle of existing in the middle of all this other stuff that's going on, that we have to deal with on a multi-level approach. So, but being going through what I've gone through, I went to Catholic school, grammar school, high school, and then I went to an HBCU. And you say, oh well, that was great, but it was a culture shock, because I'm coming from a traditional conformist type of structure to an HBCU that gives you a different perspective as from what you're used to. And until I guess my early adulthood, I grew up with in Catholicism, and being graduating from an HBCU, I saw other perspectives. Going to a Baptist church from Catholic was a culture shock. It's like, oh wow, never knew. This is something new to me, but it wasn't necessarily strange, because these were things that were all rooted in our history. So, I mentioned all of these things to say that everyone, we have large ideas and we want to attack each individual thing, but it's going to take the diversity of thought and the evolution of thought to bring you into that fold. And if you want me to be more specific, I'll be more specific. But it's just, like I said, you have the Black culture. You have, in Chicago, with it being a very segregated, one of the most segregated cities in this entire country outside of New York, historically, you had different sides of town. On the south side of Chicago, you had your African-American community. On the west side of Chicago, you may have had your white community. On the north side, you had your Irish and Lithuanian, Czechoslovakian, Puerto Rican. Chicago was really a melting pot, but it really wasn't, because it was segregated into these communities that you never integrated with. You never dealt with them unless you went someplace like school. And most of us grew up in predominantly Black schools, unless you went to Catholic school. That was something different. But once again, it's how we want to deal with those individual components, given the level of challenges that we have, in African American. I heard someone earlier mention that, you speak white, and that comes from our own community as we're trying to, elevate ourselves to a different level. If you've ever read the book Color Complex, there's a whole different dynamic between colorism, the politics of colorism in the African American community. So it's a lot of different things that we have to deal with in combination with white supremacy and racism, and being subject to a repressive apparatus, with dealing with law enforcement, and having to teach our children how to deal with those to deal with that police encounter, where with your white family, that's not necessarily a concern of theirs. So I'm just going to leave it there because you look anxious.
Again, it's a whole week's worth of conversation, I think. And looking at the clock,
Yep,
we are unfortunately out of time.
we are. And Lisa, I want to say thank you to you. You are a star, by the way. And
Thank you.
and I wish we could have gotten further in. Maybe we can do this again and come back to some of those things. But thank you, and thank you to the panel. I do want to say to Wayne Jacobson, Wayne, you are being advertised too. Every time Tom Selleck comes on and talks about reverse mortgages, that's right at you. So
I've never seen that, so can't be right at me. I've never.
Come on, it's really funny. Or stair climbers. That's in your wheelhouse. So
no, it's not my wheelhouse.
Guys, this has been good. It's been enlightening. I've got so many thoughts running around through my head that I would love to share, but here we are. So maybe we can do this again. So thank you to everybody. And we'll see.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, guys, for having me. I appreciate it.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jasmine, for getting up
Yes, Jasmine, we appreciate it.
from China. Thank you.
I got two choices. I can go back to sleep or I can go work out. It's raining.
Oh, go
so it's
work
probably
out.
Gonna
Go
be
work
option one.
There you go.
Back to sleep.